Hi, I'm Pastor Mark. Welcome to A Talk with Ted. We've been discussing conversations. And Ted, we've started last week about this really important topic of how to communicate with one another. And maybe we could rewind and just highlight some things we talked about last week.
I think one of the things I need to do when I'm trying to communicate with my partner, when I'm trying to get the message out, I need to learn to say, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is what I know.
Okay.
And I have to train my partner to listen to that, and sometimes it would be just when they start to interrupt, just a timeout. I always say, get the facts before you react, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But what I want to do is to be able to communicate my message to my partner so that they hear what I'm saying and they acknowledge that and affirm that for me so I understand that they've heard that message.
Okay, why is it important that we even have this conversation?
Because I think with this COVID especially, I think we've been cooped up together and that's not normal for us to be under the same roof almost 24/7.
Yeah.
And if I can find that place of saying, okay, now how do I make the effort to have that communication or that conversation back and forth so it doesn't become conflict?
Okay. So are there some steps we can take to have better communication with those that we live with?
I think the first thing is to clearly communicate what I want to say. And a definition I pulled off the internet this week that I thought was very good is listening is the ability to accurately receive and interpret the message that makes effective communication. So if I can hear the message and then effectively allow that to be a part of who I am, or listening to my partner to say this is a part of who you are, and acknowledging that, it can be a very positive step of human communication, human relationships. And I think that can be very, very helpful for us.
Okay, so first listen, understand.
Right.
And what was the third one?
To be able to allow ourselves to hear what the other person is saying rather than try to interpret what the other person is saying. You said this effectively last week. We jump to the conclusion before we've heard the full thing. So I need to hear the facts before I react. If you can remember that statement, facts before I react. So listen to the facts before you respond to that. And when we get the facts, then we can properly respond to it.
Okay.
I want to focus in a little bit on something that I read a number of years ago, and I use it quite often in counseling. It's by a book by Gary Chapman. Gary Chapman is a Christian author, and he has a book called Desperate Marriages. And I think he effectively helps me to understand how to respond to a situation where maybe there's a workaholic in the family or an alcoholic or whatever the case may be. And if I can look at myself first before I looked at the other person and what they're communicating. And Gary has 6 things he says that I think is very, very helpful.
Okay.
First of all, he says, I'm responsible for my own attitude. When I come into a situation, I can either be looking as half full or half empty. I want to kind of neutralize that a little bit and say, okay, I just want to have an attitude of listening skills and allowing me to understand what the other person is saying. Attitude can be really, really important in a relationship because the second point is our attitude leads to our actions. If I have a indifference toward the person, that's going to be very clearly seen. And one thing we're going to talk about next week a little bit as we continue this conversation is to do what we're doing, make eye contact. Listen, but not just listen to hear, listen to see that reaction from the other person. You can tell by body language what they're feeling and thinking at that point. It can be really, really helpful. Yeah. So if I look at my attitude, and I'm responsible for my attitude, not for yours, but for mine. And then if I realize that the attitude leads to my actions, and then I need to understand I can't change anybody. If I'm trying to change my partner, it's not going to work. But I can influence. So my influence, I always say to people, my influence is more with honey than vinegar. You get my point? Yeah. If I can listen carefully and allow God to work in me to listen to that conversation or that complaint or whatever it might be, it can really be helpful for me to stop and say, okay, how do I influence my partner, but how do I let my partner influence me too? I need to let my partner influence me before I try to go the other way. So if I'm listening carefully and saying, okay, what's that look like for you, and how does that work? It can be very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And then be careful that you're not trying to convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong.
Yeah.
I want a win-win.
Yeah.
And a win-win says, okay, I want you to win, but again, as I sense what I'm feeling, I want to be able to express to you how I feel, and then there's that win-win. Win-lose will never work.
Mm. Yeah, in one book I read about communication, they talked about having, this is part of what's called a demon dialogue, and the first step in that demon dialogue is find the bad guy, right? Find the bad guy. Are you? No, I'm right. No, I'm right.
Yeah, that's
right?
right.
And
That's
both
right.
of us are right. And so you just have this dance, right? You can't ever get to the point because you're dancing around the point trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong. And that never works, right?
And that's where compromise comes in. I have to identify and affirm what that other person is saying, so I can say, okay, this is where we start that conversation of trying to get to an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth thing he says is, don't allow your emotions control your action.
Oh.
There's a time when you know it's going to be volatile to stop.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to say, time out. Let's take a break. Let's both walk away for a minute, and let's set a more suitable time. When we come to conflict resolution, I think that's a good point. Find a place where we're both in a good place before we start to try to solve conflict. And if we can do that, if we can just say, okay, I'll take the responsibility for that. I'm not feeling very good right now about this, and I know it's going south, and I want to be able to say, okay, what's the next step to make that work for us?
Yeah, speaking to that first point, I'll bet you all of us could relate to those conversations we have where somebody will say something to us, and we get a little flared up, and they'll say, what's wrong? Why are you acting like that? And then we'll sort of blame them, for our actions. And what you said is everyone is responsible for their own actions and attitudes, right?
And that's when we try to cast the blame on the other person. Well, you've done that to me. Well, okay, but that's not the point right now. We don't want to blame each other. We want to say, this is, coming back to what I said before, this is how I feel right now. Could be right, could be wrong, but this is, just hear me out. Just hear what I'm
and stick
feeling.
to the topic.
That's right.
Not your, what do I say? Not your feelings? Is that a correct way to say that? I'm not thinking about so much how I feel about it as much as what is the issue?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then because you fail once, you're not a terrible person. You're a human being. We're going to fail. But that's when we come back and say, okay, what did we do there that didn't work very well? I think that's a good conversation you can have with your partner at that point. What did that look like for you?
Right.
What was it that I said that really hurt you at that point? And if you can say to yourself, something, admitting imperfection doesn't mean you failed, just means you're human. I mean, we'll all fail at some point in communication skills. I've been married for 52 years, and I've failed many, many times. But you know something? We grow in that.
Yeah.
And now we know when to stop that and say, okay, let's go back and review where we were so we can be in a healthy place. And I would say to you, there's very, very few disagreements now because we've learned to, you're a different personality than I am, and we learn to do that.
Yeah.
And then the final point he makes is he's looking at you dealing with this issue. He's saying love is the most powerful weapon for good in the world. If I can, and I've said this to you before, if I can somehow express to my partner, I do love you. Because sometimes when we get into a disagreement, all of a sudden the other person's saying, oh, I guess he's leaving me or she's leaving me.
Yeah,
I don't want to
that's
go there. I want to say, I do love you. I do have a concern I have, but I want to lay out a very constructive way of dealing with it. And then we can go into the fact, and as we will next week, of more, okay, what are some of the steps I can take to really, really listen to what you're saying and help? Maybe that would be helpful for each one of us.
You know
Helpful for me.
you know what I'm learning these days is never assume that I know what the other person is thinking or feeling. Because as soon as I do that, I portray my own feelings on them, and it sort of reflects, and then it just blows up. Right?
We'll say this more than once because this is a very important step. I need to affirm what you're saying, so I'm going to say, okay, this is what I hear you saying. And she'll say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not saying I'm angry. I'm a little frustrated right now, but I'm not angry.
Yeah.
Or maybe I am angry. Yeah, okay. So, no, tell me what that looks like so I can look and see if it's me, or is it something I've said or done?
Right.
Or maybe it's work. Maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it's something I can't. Listen, guys, we're trying to fix things, and we got to get that idea of our mind to fix it. We need to stop and listen. And then as we listen, maybe there's a strategy there of saying, okay, here's a better way of handling this, and God will do the work in our lives. What's it say in Scripture? We're to be quick to listen,
Yeah.
slow to speak, and slow to anger. You used that in one of your podcasts recently.
Yeah.
And I think about that. And there's another verse in Proverbs that says, a soft answer turns away wrath. If I can stop and say, okay, my partner's upset right now, maybe at that point I can slow it down a little bit by saying, okay, I'm just going to listen. I'm just going to listen. And I'm not good at that.
Yeah. These are very helpful hints that you've given to us, and we're going to continue this conversation next week. And if you would like to continue to discuss these ideas, you could write to the email at the bottom of the screen, and Pastor Ted will get back to you and continue the conversation. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Yes. See you next week.